In our discussion about class-based components or stateful components, one of the questions that I said we need to ask as to whether or when we're determining whether something should be a class-based or a functional component is, do we need to know about its lifecycle events? And if the answer is no, we usually choose a functional component. If the answer is yes, then we will choose a stateful component. But you can access lifecycle events the easiest inside of a class-based component or a stateful component. Now, what is lifecycle and what does that mean? Well, lifecycle has to do with how a particular component is created and the steps in that creation and then the steps in the disposal of that component when it's removed from the page. And that is the component's lifecycle. Its birth, its life, and then its death. And during that process, there are various events that React provides to us that we can hook into to know when an event is about to happen, or when a transition has ended, or when a transition begins. In other words, transitioning from the component being created to the component being available, to the component being rendered, to the component getting ready to be destroyed. Sometimes we need to know when those things are happening so we can respond to them appropriately within our component. Now, some of those lifecycle events we're already familiar with because we've actually used them. The first one is the constructor. The constructor is part of the component lifecycle. It is when the component, when it is first getting created, is being initialized, when it is being set up and its state is being created and its props are being set up in the component and being set up inside of the actual custom component that we have. So constructor is the first event in that life cycle that we deal with on a regular basis. Another one is the render event. And the render event happens when the component has been created and it is ready to be displayed on the page. So this is another event that we use all the time and we take for granted as being, we don't ever think that it's actually part of the component lifecycle, but it really is. Another one that we will find ourselves using frequently, and usually I add these right here under the constructor as events that we are going to be handling. One of those is component did mount. And component did mount is a really good one to know about because it is responsible for letting us know that after the component has been created and the output has been rendered to the DOM, in other words, after this render event has happened, then this event happens and says that the component has been created, it has been set up, and it has been mounted as a part of your React app. In other words, it's in the page and it's ready to go. And we can see this when we do a console.log. And let's see here. Let's go ahead and put the name of our event here. Oops, I accidentally removed my quote. And let's say event fired. And then we'll go ahead and see what happens inside of our browser when we pull open our app and we look at our console and we reload the page. We can see an event fired, component did mount. So let's go ahead and do a couple of other console.logs and let's see in what order these end up getting fired. So let's add another one here for our constructor. Let's do an event fired, and then let's just change this to constructor. And then let's go ahead and do another one down here for our render. Save all of those, and let's come back to our browser. Let's refresh. And as expected, just as explained, the constructor gets fired first because that's when the component is being initialized. Render gets called because that's when the actual element is being rendered to the page. And then component did mount tells us that the initialization and the rendering and everything has completed, and the component has been mounted, and it is now a part of our application. And of course, I keep circling this to-do list, but really we're talking down here about the create to-do component because that's where we've been adding these lifecycle events. Another one to know about is the component will unmount. Will unmount right here. Let's add a fire event and let's put it in here. Let's go back to our thing here. We've got constructor, render, and component did mount, but we don't see a component will unmount. And that is because right now this component is in our page. It has been mounted. It's a part of our React application, and we really don't have anything that's going to make it go away. In order to get this event to fire, we would need to go ahead and have something that would remove this component from the page. And when I say remove, I'm not saying hide or show the JSX. I'm saying something that would actually remove this component completely from our application. And we're not going to do that right now, but it is a lifecycle event that you need to be aware of. Now, those are the most common ones that you're going to mess with or that you will use in your application is the did mount and the component will unmount, as well as the render and the constructor. Now, the cool thing is that as you get or as you build more complex React components, you'll end up needing more and more events for specific situations. And there are actually quite a few component events that we can handle on our own. Another one that you might use would be component did catch. And component did catch, you can do an error and an info. And in component did catch, what will happen is that it will catch any errors within the component that are not handled by your code. And so it will catch those errors from within the component. And with this lifecycle event, you can catch those errors, and then you could store them in your local state and then show a message to the user instead of having your component simply crash and die. And so an example of that where you're going to store it could be this.setState, and then you could, inside of your object, add error, and then pass it that error. And then you could add info and pass it that info. Or you could use the reduced syntax of our object literal and just pass it error and info. And now inside of your state, if your component did have an uncaught error or an error that you didn't handle, you can catch it, and instead of your component dying, you can then check to see if there is an error, and if there is an error, hide this and display a message to your user instead by checking to see if there was an error. You can use a ternary operator to do that, or do something above the return to determine that. And then you can either show the full UI or you can show an error message UI instead and provide your user with some feedback as to what went wrong within the component. Or if you're doing any kind of logging, you could probably have it send an error log to an API and log that error so that you can debug it later. Super useful component event lifecycle handler right there. So those are the ones we're going to cover. You will want to go ahead and look through the React documentation, and you can, of course, find that on React and look at lifecycle methods and state. And then there is a complete listing of all the lifecycle. This one just shows you how to use them, but there is an API reference down here, and inside of that reference you can go look at all of the events for a particular for the lifecycle of a component, and then look and see if any of those other ones that are less frequently used fit your use case. For now, though, these are the most important ones that you need to have.